And Allie, we were expecting some softness there. We certainly saw it on the U.S. side. One thing that was surprising, you actually saw a little bit more strength in China and overseas. What did you make of the report?
Yeah, I was encouraged to see the better results from the international segment. I think in terms of what we were looking for in the print, we're certainly expecting a little bit of a weaker print from a comp perspective, and certainly saw that in terms of the U.S., but not significantly worse than we were expecting, but definitely encouraged by the solid international results. So encouraged to see that.
What exactly do you want to hear out of Brian Niccol later today in terms of articulating his long-term vision for Starbucks?
I think certainly we would like to hear an update on the different strategic initiatives that they've outlined. Some of the bigger things that we want to hear about, the focus on the 4-minute wait time for orders, any progress that they've made on that we think will be important. And then also just in terms of the order sequencing within the app, that's a pilot test that they talked about during the Q1 call, and that was in just 3 stores, but I think is something that's going to be very important for the future with the mobile ordering. So I'm curious to hear an update on that because I think it'll be really important, both of those metrics, for improving throughput for Starbucks in the future.
I'm just going to jump in here really quickly because we also just got earnings out of Snap, the social media company that teenagers love. And here we have a company saying its daily active users were about 460 million, just slightly higher than the expected 459. And that top line revenue has grown, but headwinds began in the current quarter. First quarter revenue coming at $1.36 billion, just slightly above the consensus estimate of $1.35 billion. And Snap has omitted formal guidance for this quarter because of the uncertain macro conditions. So again, top line revenue grew in the first quarter, but the headwinds began showing up in that period. And as a result, it has omitted formal second quarter guidance. The stock currently down about 2% in after hours trade. Abby, let me come back to you when it comes to Starbucks, because one thing about Brian Niccol, he's done a tremendous job at his previous employer, Chipotle, but he didn't necessarily have the international experience that leading Starbucks would require. Some of his initiatives to improve the customer experience at Starbucks in the U.S., including, you mentioned, reducing the wait time to under 4 minutes. Do those things translate well in a market like China?
We think it's important, certainly. I think that's universal. The one thing with Brian, he's really been focused on the U.S. market and less so on the international. I think when he came out and spoke about a lot of his plans, he's really been focused on turning around the U.S. business. But I think a lot of the different initiatives that he's done will translate to China and the other international markets.
How are you thinking about the cost to put in some of those efficiencies? He's talked about store renovations because some of the stores were looking a little bit tired, at least here in the U.S. All those efficiency improvements. I mean, if you want to get wait times under 4 minutes, you're going to have to hire more people. You're going to have to bring back the condiment bars. How much are you comfortable seeing Starbucks spend on these improvements?
I think the one thing I'll say is I agree they're going to need to spend to make the improvements, but we heard even on the last quarterly earnings call a much more deliberate and just thoughtful way of thinking about costs. And just the example I'll give is when they talked about the siren technology, instead of those being rolled out to all of the stores, they're really focusing on that now on only the top quartile of stores, because those are the stores that really need that advanced technology. So I think in terms of certainly there's going to be incremental costs that are going to come out, but I've been encouraged thus far by Brian and the team taking a much more deliberate and thoughtful approach to costs, not just being across the board and necessarily in every store, but instead in the stores specifically that'll need to see those costs.
Headlines also crossing the wire here, Abby, on the idea that Starbucks, as you would expect, says that it is seeing challenges when it comes to tariffs, as well as obviously the volatility that we've been seeing really long before this president's administration in coffee prices, as well as other commodity prices that might actually affect the company. What options do they have to mitigate that?
Those are two of the key factors that we've been watching. I think one of the obvious ones will be in terms of pricing, but I think they'll continue to be very deliberate with pricing given the sensitivity there. We also saw them make some changes in the first quarter around eliminating the alternative dairy costs. So I think that's one way for them to do it, is just pricing across the board, but I think they'll be very strategic where they need to price that. And I also just think their scale gives them a natural advantage to be able to help both hedge some of the costs and be able to find more creative ways to offset them given their scale relative to some of their peers.
Yeah, can you talk a little bit more about that? Because we know that they usually hedge against rises in Arabica coffee prices, those beans, through futures. And they're not usually relying on Robusta beans. But is that an option for a company like Starbucks? Or do they still need to get back to basics first before they expand and get creative with their beans?
I think both will be important. I think really improving the customer experience is going to be paramount for them. And I think, that has clearly been one of the main areas that Brian has been focused on. But I also think the cost side of things is really important. And I think that they'll continue to be strategic in how they try to reduce some of those costs and how to be able to solve some of those problems. So I don't think it's an either or. I think that they'll be able to do both of those.